Right. So, in this video, I really want to focus on the destructive impact that slavery and colonialism had on Africa as a continent, and how I really believe that a lot of those same principles or values that were held in those times are still lingering in some shape or format in certain dynamics between the UN and Africa as a continent. However, before we begin to do that, I think that it is very important for me to shine a light on Africa pre-colonialism, because what dominates public perception, or what dominates a lot of headlines, is this idea or this picture of Africa being this basic civilization, this civilization which was far from development and did not experience any form of advancement in any way. But on the contrary, before colonization, Africa was this deeply advanced and this beautiful meshing pot of ideas of community, advancement in science and fashion and all of these different things. But that's not the image that we receive. It was a continent that was filled with great diversity in so many different ways. It was not discovered, but it was the center of a thriving trade network that connected sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa, West Africa, to the Middle East, to Asia. It was at the forefront of scientific and technological breakthroughs. Scientists and mathematicians from the continent pre-colonization made significant contributions to our modern science and maths, and that cannot be ignored. Our architecture was beautiful but also symbolic, and it was symbolic of the deep, diverse culture and communities that we were a part of. Our clothes and our jewelry and the way that we wore them and the confidence that we wore them in still influence trends in the fashion industry today. Before colonizations, Africans built cities, they built education networks, and they practiced various religious and traditional ways of life. All of these things built a way of living that was more nuanced and more advanced than we could ever describe or that is ever shown. So before we get into what we're going to be getting into, we need to start from the understanding that Africa was not discovered. It was not this desolate place. It was a thriving civilization that was home to so many incredible minds, that was home to people. It was not this primitive place that needed European help, but it was a thriving society whose sophisticated history deserves to be told as much as its trauma. And so I hope that what I've said has just truly painted even a bit of a picture at what Africa truly was and what was lost during colonialism. Because in the 1880s, when European countries engaged in the scramble for Africa, and the continent was divided up in a room with no regard for the human consequences, and all in the name of economic gains and global influence, when Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Germany, and Italy, and Belgium all engaged in this vicious pillaging of the continent, the history and lives of every African from that point on was changed intrinsically forever. Because for almost a century, these European colonizers introduced and established a system of exploitation that was backed by government policy and law. And these exploitative practices preceded some of the darkest moments in human history, from introducing the transatlantic slave trade to the open looting of African resources, land, and raw materials for the enrichment of these European nations. These European colonizers exercised greater and greater control over the African continent, the consequences of which we are still living through, in addition to the human toll and the pain that they caused in their pursuit of these resources. The system that was instituted was designed to reform Africa to be a European reproduction site. Anything that the European nations needed to develop their nations, they would use Africa as that source of that. So if the Europeans needed cotton, that is what is going to be grown. If they needed gold, it was going to be taken. If they needed workers, Africans would be used. It was a system that was ingrained, each and every aspect of life was, of anyone from the continent, was their value was connected to what they could give to these European nations. They were dehumanized to benefit other nations. Colonialism is driven by self-interest. At its core, it is about valuing my needs over the humanity of someone else, over the autonomy of someone else. Colonialism dismembered and dehumanized every single, not only the people, but also the land. It instituted a system that justified mass death, sexual violence, forced labor, environmental degradation, all for economic gain. Previously vibrant cultures and religions and ways of life were eroded because they do not fit, because they do not benefit the European gaze. And it was this breaking of the identity that was at the core of what colonialism strived towards. It is breaking someone down of everything that attached them to the land, to people, to each other. Colonialism was a system of domination in the most visceral and ugly aspects of that word. And we can't do enough to really even paint a picture to describe the impact of this system, which seeped into every part of life, which choked out any form of life that had any semblance of what was before. It was a system that stole, that destroyed, and that killed anything that stood in its way, that stood in opposition to the self-interest of the colonial rule. And so yes, when colonialism came rumbling to a stop between the 50s and the 90s, and countries began to gain independence, we appreciate the fight and the struggle that all of those men and women who sacrificed their lives, who sacrificed families, who sacrificed their own comfort for our independence now. And we have to also realize that that fight isn't over, because colonialism was not a system that can just be written away because of a piece of paper, because it has significantly altered so much of the social, relational, and economic dynamics between the continent of Africa and the rest of the world. And these dynamics that have been left by this colonial era still hover over our modern day, because we see it in every trade agreement, we see it in every development grant, or in these very predatory loans that African countries receive. And so that's why we say that you can't just write off colonialism with ink on a paper. So I believe that these colonial tendencies are still very much alive and well in our modern times. And that brings me to a sphere of how these previous behaviors and tendencies is revealing itself, which is in the UN. Because when the UN was formed after World War II, concept was brilliant. It was a way to, avoid world conflict, to promote peace, to promote cooperation. It was a space where global superpowers like the USA can have the same amount of, can have the same space to vote equally with a country which is as small as Swaziland. I think that overall, the UN has been a net positive. And in the 80 years that the UN has been operating, it has been instrumental in delivering vital humanitarian aid to countless countries. It has protected human rights. It has advocated for the most marginalized populations. It has been so instrumental in promoting development outcomes in education and women's rights in healthcare across the globe. And so I think that it's so important to highlight these beautiful and incredible things that the UN has done. But what happens when a group of people can go into a room and decide unilaterally, and oftentimes against the majority vote, where resources get to go, whose rights get to be recognized, and are able to actively impede against vital humanitarian relief? There's no accountability for the lives which are lost because of these decisions. And what is often seen behind these decisions is that they often come out of two things: self-interest and economic gain. And that's what I believe the UN Security Council to be. It is a modern reiteration of these colonial dynamics, of these colonial behaviors and patterns of operations, which shift power away from the democratic processes and shift that power to a privileged few, which in the UN Security Council is in this veto power. And so the P5, the US, Russia, France, China, and Britain, have the ability to wield this veto power in a way that to me is very reminiscent of what happened in the 1880s in the scramble for Africa, where resources were pillaged. And I think it's even worse in this reiteration because it goes against the very institution that they are centered in, that they are housed in. The UN is supposed to represent equal cooperation, fairness. It's supposed to represent justice. And so to have a structure in it that is so tailored to self-interest, that is so tailored to being influenced by economic gain, it goes against the very values, the very mission of what the UN was built on. Because for 188 countries to be beholden to 5 countries, to be beholden to these 5 countries' decision making, their influence, what they decide to be good, what they decide to institute across the world, that is not a democracy. And what we're seeing now is that without any accountability, without any formal checks, the veto power that these countries have is falling in line with colonial tendencies, where funding and geopolitical engagement defines what is passed or what is vetoed. And the result of this is that we are seeing a UN which is becoming hollowed out from the inside. Its effectiveness is being eroded. Its ability to stand up to injustice, its ability to stand up to evil. And it doesn't just end with the UN. We are seeing this with the ICJ, the ICC. All of these very pivotal and important safeguards for our global justice system are being eroded. And a small group of nations are coming into these power vacuums. And they're acting with impunity, with disregard for human life, for the sake of economic gain and self-interest. And so, as the UN turns 80, I think that it is important to highlight the wins, the beautiful work that they've done, the incredible work that they have done across the globe. That, it's very important to highlight that. But it's also important to stand up against the injustices that are occurring in it, and to call for reforms to these countries which are operating from these very dangerous places. Because if this is the start of it, imagine what's going to happen 5 years, even 6 months from now. Honestly, what is going to happen 6 months from now? And so I think that the UN has a very tricky relationship with colonialism, and I think that we are seeing the results of that in how the Security Council was born and how it is functioning. And that is something that we shouldn't be quiet about. we should keep speaking about it. We should keep talking about it, because once you allow it to foster in a space of darkness, that's when it gets worse. So we have to keep speaking about it, because that brings light to the situation. And so I think that that's very important for us to do. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So that was that. I hope that this has been more informative, and I think also it's important to say that your joy, don't lose your joy. I think that's also something, just as encouragement, to leave like with a sense of encouragement, because for me, I really believe that joy is resistance. Joy is resistance, even in the face of so much evil, so much hate, so much destruction. Joy is resistance. So keep being joyful, keep striving for love with other people, striving to love people, even strangers, in whatever that looks like, in like maybe it's your family, it's greeting a stranger, all of these different things, man. As dark as it gets, keep striving for joy, keep striving for love, man. Alright, that is it. I will see you guys somewhere, somehow, on one of these channels. Most probably I will see you on the path tomorrow. So thank you very much.